Hello and welcome to this episode of Futures, the podcast series brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Hi everyone and welcome to the CIPS Futures podcast. James Moore here alongside my co-host for today, Maxfield Weiss, CIPS's Global Head of Sustainability. Really delighted to have you joining us for the podcast, Maxfield. How are you? Do you want to just very briefly give us a bit of introduction and background as to your role?
Yeah, thanks, James. I'm well. It's great to be here, and it's great to be on the podcast for the first time. As said, I just recently joined CIPS as the Global Head of Sustainability, the first ever for the organization. But before that, I was at CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, working on global environmental data and reporting. And I've also led responsible sourcing at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. So if I look at my perspective, I spent most of my career sitting between influence and execution, helping turn big sustainability ambitions into practical value-driving action. And I was thinking about this, but being on the podcast for the first time, I think the most important lens I bring, especially for a procurement audience, is actually quite simple. And that is that procurement now sits at the center of sustainability. Because if you look at where impacts really happen, it's upstream, right? It's in supply chains. It's shaped by who organizations buy from, how they source, how they balance costs, risk, and value. So if that's where the impact sits, right, procurement has to be at the center of the response. And whether people realize it or not, if you're in the procurement profession, you're actually in the sustainability business now. So what we're seeing is that sustainability isn't a separate agenda anymore. It's becoming part of how organizations think about performance, how they think about resilience and long-term value as well. We're seeing in this space a lot of noise. The idea that is ESG dead? Is ESG being pulled back? And that isn't the reality. It's not going away. It's being embedded. It's being embedded into the core of how business decisions are made. And that's what is shifting for the role of procurement as well, and the CPO. And what I think is a really exciting way. It's moving from focusing purely on cost and efficiency to owning a much broader definition of value, of risk, of resilience, and increasingly sustainable transformation. So for CIPS, the opportunity really is about translating that into what good procurement looks like in practice and how we scale that across the profession, all the way from the classroom to the boardroom.
Fantastic. What a great introduction. And certainly agree with those comments, and something we've found in the recent Global State of Procurement and Supply 2026 that we've launched as well. So for those who haven't seen, we'll put a link in the episode description to that new report, because it's really worth a read, and some great comments from you, Maxfield, in that as well. But look, fantastic. Great to have you on with us. You've got a really strong background in the world of ESG and sustainability, as you've just mentioned. And it's why you've joined us today to talk to a really fantastic guest who I think we and the wider CIPS community can learn a lot from on the impact our buying decisions can have on nature, the natural environment, as well as connecting some of those circularity dots. Someone from outside the profession, but who can really help put it into perspective as to why sustainability action is so important and so urgent, I think, and why procurement is in such a unique position to act. So a warm welcome to today's guest. Joining us all the way from New Zealand, Kayla Kingdon-Bebb, Chief Executive of the New Zealand chapter of the leading global environmental charity WWF. Kayla, welcome. How are you?
Kia ora. Greetings. I'm well, thank you.
Brilliant. Well, fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Lots to get into, Kayla, but should we just start, if you'd like to give us a quick overview of the WWF? I think set up in 1961, I believe, now active all over the world. But can you just give us a snapshot of the size of the WWF and your mission?
So we're either known internationally as the World Wildlife Fund or the Worldwide Fund for Nature. But in short, that's WWF. And you'd probably recognize us by our iconic panda logo. When I'm speaking and introducing myself to people, I often have to clarify that we're the pandas, not the wrestlers. But we were founded in 1961, and WWF is one of the world's largest conservation organizations. I'd say we're probably one of the most impactful as well, highly independent and active in around 100 countries. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And despite our size globally and our brand recognition, people are usually quite surprised to find that in New Zealand, we're quite small. We've got around 12 staff. So I always like to say that we punch above our weight in terms of what we achieve. But WWF's mission globally and here in New Zealand is to protect and restore our natural environment and to build a future where people live in harmony with nature. We do that in a number of different ways. Our ways of working is often to work on the ground with communities on conservation projects. But in New Zealand, our focus is particularly around policy advocacy and with corporate partnerships. So we work with government and with industry to advocate for nature-positive transformation. And in Aotearoa, we also have a really strong focus on protecting the ocean, our marine territory, because New Zealand has one of the biggest ocean territories in the world. It's actually 14 times larger than our landmass. It's huge. And it's home to upwards of 80% of our endemic biodiversity. But at the moment, we're not looking after it particularly well. So that's a really big focus for us.
Great, Kayla. For me, I'd love to zoom out a little bit with you. When we're looking at the data, I mentioned I come from a data organization. So for me, data is key. When looking at the data across climate and nature, what are the clearest signals that the environmental change is already starting to affect how our economies, maybe our societies function? And do you think businesses really grasp how urgent this is?
I think that they are increasingly beginning to. So my view, Maxfield, is that in the last sort of 3 to 5 years, we're beginning to see a real seismic shift in boardrooms, actually, where directors are beginning to think about nature and climate risk, not just as mandatory or voluntary reporting obligations, but as part of their good governance practice in terms of managing like the medium-term risk horizon for their enterprises. And I know you asked me to zoom out, but I'm going to zoom right in for you. Because yesterday, my neighborhood in New Zealand received an entire month of rainfall in a single hour. We're going into winter, so we had 77 millimeters in a single hour. It was extremely intense. It was highly localized. It flooded catastrophically. I mean, my neighbors, most of them are flooded right now. And a week ago, we had a tropical cyclone, which we don't usually get in New Zealand. And so I know we're not alone in this. It's not just, New Zealand that's seeing it. All over the world, it seems like every other week we're having some climate-fueled weather event. And companies, industry, governments, even if they wish to, can no longer ignore the reality that climate change and nature loss is on our doorstep. It's here. It's here. And we have no choice but to confront it. I will step back now and actually answer your question around zooming out. You said you're a data man, so I have some stats to dazzle you with. Honestly, I think it's incontrovertible that we are at a tipping point right now globally. So nature loss and climate change are accelerating faster than most people realize. They're no longer distant threats. The rate of biodiversity loss on planet Earth right now is higher now than in any other time in human history. So we have about 1 million species at risk of extinction globally. That's completely unprecedented in human history. And more alarming than that is that wildlife populations have declined by an average of 70% since 1970. It's a dramatic acceleration in the last 5 decades. So here is the stat I'm going to leave you with because I still am completely alarmed by it. Wild mammals on Earth now only account for about 4% of Earth's mammalian biomass, while humans and livestock make up the remaining 96%. And more than half of that is livestock. The decline in the natural world that humans have driven since the beginning of civilization it's catastrophic. And as you probably know, over half of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So this biodiversity loss is not just an environmental problem, it's economic risk, right? And nature loss, is often less immediately visible than climate change. I mean, when your neighborhood has flooded, it's pretty immediately apparent, but it's happening just as quickly. And these two crises amplify each other.
I think that's a really important element to bring out in this, Kayla, the link between climate and biodiversity loss and the economic environment. I think, that really often puts it into sharp focus maybe for businesses. Can you give us an insight into maybe some of the more localized environmental issues that you're seeing in New Zealand, and also maybe if you can sort of elaborate on that and link it to the economics and the business sort of element as well?
So globally, New Zealand has this sort of clean green image. We're the land of Lord of the Rings, right? We've got these outstanding natural landscapes. And that's true. But what a lot of people don't realize is that New Zealand has one of the highest proportions of threatened species in the world. We have over 4,000 species at risk. And part of that is because these wonderful remote islands evolved in isolation for so very long. We have very, very high levels of endemism, which means the species that exist here, many of them exist nowhere else on Earth. And if we lose them from New Zealand, they're gone from the planet forever. And the drivers of nature loss in New Zealand are pretty straightforward, actually. They're kind of, we have that in common with the rest of the world. So it's primarily through the loss of habitat, where we've had land cleared primarily for farming in our case, the impact of introduced predators like rats, possums, cats, and stoats, because a lot of our special birds in New Zealand actually are flightless or nest on the ground, so they're highly susceptible to them. Overexploitation, so freshwater habitats, whether it's freshwater extraction or discharge or overexploitation of commercial fisheries, and climate change. And despite all of that kind of landscape of threat, New Zealand's economy is heavily dependent on nature. So we primarily export food to the world, right? Whether it's dairy or it's sheep and beef or it's wool or honey or wine, we're primarily agricultural and heavily reliant on a healthy natural environment and a stable economy to produce those goods. So you'd be familiar that the World Economic Forum, in their sort of near-term risk horizon assessment, rates climate change and ecosystem collapse as sort of some of the top risks in the next 10 years. My contention is that because of New Zealand's economic framing, because we rely on primary production and nature-based tourism, our risk exposure to climate change and nature loss is actually quite a lot higher than the global average. And some of our leading producers, I think, also realize that. So we've got a real strong cohort of producers in New Zealand where they're at a governance level around their boardroom tables and right down through their kind of corporate structures, through their supply chain, are really beginning to grapple with dealing to nature risk and biodiversity loss in their operations. And they're doing it, partially because it's the right thing to do, but they're also doing it to protect shareholder value. And that's fair enough. Everyone's going to have to do that eventually.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important point. And whether you look at from that local or global perspective, as you so eloquently have done for us today, but because there is that disconnect, I think we talk about nature as foundational to the economy, right? From ecosystem services or nature positivity, but we haven't really historically treated it as a consistent driver in decision making. And I think that's where that disconnect comes into play and why we can make that connection point to procurement, because with procurement, it's where that starts to shift, right? Because it's where those dependencies become tangible in a way through supplier selection, sourcing strategies, how value is defined, all the things I laid out in my opening thought. But what's changing now is that this is no longer abstract, right? It's starting to show up in real, very immediate ways. So I think for me, if we were to dive into this as part of this conversation, picking up on that idea, organizations are already dealing with cost pressure. They're dealing with supply chain disruptions, AI, geopolitics are rampant right now. Where do you see nature-related risks already coming through in those challenges? And how should organizations start rethinking value so this becomes part of everyday decision-making rather than something separate or disconnected?
Oh, it's such a good question. There are two thoughts that I want to pick up on there, I guess. So I worked in the private sector before joining WWF, but a long time ago. And before I immediately joined WWF, I was in public policy and government for about a decade. And your comment, Maxfield, that nature isn't properly considered necessarily in decision making really rings true for me. So for a number of years, I had a front row seat toward the way that governments took decisions, whether it was a policy shift or whether it's a decision, an investment decision in the annual budget process. And it'll come as no surprise to you that in New Zealand, just like pretty much any other country in the world, when a government's contemplating a policy move or an investment, they do a cost benefit analysis. And over time, we saw evolutions in how that cost benefit analysis was done. So, for example, post Paris Agreement, we had a climate lens that was needing to be applied to all of our cabinet decision making. But I have long contended that because of the struggles that we've had in grappling with natural capital, the struggles that we've had in conceptualizing in a way that in a cost benefit analysis can see it, the role that nature and natural infrastructure plays to economic well-being, that our decision making has really been very impoverished for a long time and it's simply because governments, and I wouldn't say that this is exclusive to governments, it's fair enough for businesses and boards as well. If you're not able to conceptualize what nature is offering you or what role it is in providing benefits and to your activities, then when you're contemplating decisions for new activities or decisions that may impact upon it, you're not making a good decision, right? It's not an informed decision if you're not grappling with that aspect of the calculus. And I have long maintained that in New Zealand or in any country, if we were properly taking into account the impact of our policy and investment on natural capital, it would drive dramatically different decision-making around the cabinet table and around boardroom tables. And I think one of the interesting opportunities for procurement specialists is being able to experiment with that, actually. Because as you say, it's not just around the boardroom table that ESG is taking place. Now it's actually becoming embedded. And people who are involved in significant procurement decisions can start to think about the way that we produce and procure goods and how that impacts climate, nature, and long-term business sustainability. I think it's a really interesting opportunity.
I think so. I think you're spot on because traditionally we've optimized for cost and efficiency, right? But when you expand that definition of value to include resilience, to include security of supply, long-term performance, nature stops being invisible. And that's key, right? Because natural capital becomes something that boards and governments, as you said, can actively factor into decision-making, not just as a risk, but I think as a critical asset underpinning the economy. And that's a missing link for me. But if we were to take this one step further, and you spoke to CIPS members in Wellington last year, procurement sits right at the middle of all of this. You've said that yourself. I open that as kind of my opening thesis that I want to bring to the CIPS. So in practice, what does that mean? And how do we move from just minimizing harm to actually shaping supply chains that restore and regenerate nature and build resilience?
I'm going to give you one abstract answer, and then I will answer that question. I wanted to share two things with you around the way that we conceive of nature and the way that it can offer economic benefit, I guess. So taking the New Zealand case, I've talked about our higher than average risk exposure, but about a year and a half ago, WWF did some first in country economic analysis that showed that protecting nature could bring over $270 billion in economic benefit to the country over the next 50 years. And that is across particularly our primary sectors in tourism. And the counterfactual to that was that failing to invest to halt and reverse nature decline, the cost of inaction was significantly higher. But of course, this requires a real shift in thinking and also a real transformation in the time horizons to which we're taking decisions. The second thing that I wanted to tell you is that in addition to my full-time gig as chief executive of WWF in New Zealand, we've been doing a lot of work on trade policy recently because I'm really interested in how global trade dynamics are interfacing with climate change and nature loss. And I'm currently the deputy chair of New Zealand's domestic advisor group for the implementation of our free trade agreements with the EU and the UK. And in the context of that kind of cohort with that group, we've been talking a lot about, optically, I think if you read the newspapers, it's easy to imagine that there's a resiling from ESG or from sustainability globally because of some of the political shifts we've seen. But the evidence that we have been presented with in terms of countries that are still requiring mandatory climate disclosures, or considering climate-based adjustment mechanisms, or are promoting voluntary disclosures regimes, and again, beginning to stray into biodiversity as a second-order initiative. By and large, that's still happening, and it's become less of a, we're doing climate-based or nature-based disclosures in headlines to just kind of quietly getting on with it. So, as you say, it's becoming more embedded in corporations and in functions. And in New Zealand, for our exporters, it is no longer just a question of sustainability, credibility, achieving a price premium. Increasingly, we're seeing good sustainability and biodiversity practice as actually critical to market access. So that is my macro answer in terms of the direction of travel. And I would, I guess, just reflect that from a procurement specific perspective, organizations are juggling a lot right now. Inflation, supply chain disruption, AI transformation. I get that sustainability can feel like just one more thing. But the word that you used in your question back to me just now was about resilience. And I think that's where we need to go in terms of framing this, because sustainability is not separate from any of these pressures, right? Inflation, supply chain disruption. It's part of the solution because it actually speaks directly to business resilience.
I think that's it. Resilience really matters because it's about continuity. Can your business keep operating in the face of disruption? And what you start to look at when you compare nature-related risks, whether that's water scarcity, extreme weather, or even soil degradation, these things that seem so foreign to us, the idea of ecosystem services that are so foreign to typical topics that we think about from an economic theory perspective, those are no longer distant issues, right? They directly affect supply, cost, and reliability. So bringing resilience into the conversation, I think, is brilliant. It's really about protecting long-term value, not just managing sustainability. And I think that's key for me. We have a couple final questions here, but I really want to get underneath the hood and perhaps bring this to something that's quite practical for everyone. If you had to cut through everything we've just discussed, from resilience, economic theory, disruption, the idea of ecosystem services and biodiversity and natural capital, these big abstract things, what is one thing practical, one shift in how either organizations, let's say, or even individuals can buy that would really have the biggest positive impact for nature?
So at WWF, when we engage with the public, I have conversations all the time when people are kind of confronted with the questions of nature loss and climate change, which can seem really overwhelming, about what individual action could really make a difference? Like, what can people really do in the scale of these massive global challenges? And I think I was mentioning to James at the beginning of the call that I'm a secret procurement enthusiast. It's true. Because in addition to voting, which is very important, and in New Zealand, you only get to do once every 3 years, the most important vote that people can cast, and the one that they get to do every single day of their lives, is actually their purchasing decisions. And procurement specialists are incredibly powerful from that regard, right? Like, procurement is one of the world's most powerful levers for change. Like, when you think about procuring products or services en masse, you're shaping markets and supply chains. You're setting standards that can ripple out right across borders. Procurement professionals shape what's made, how it's made, and how responsibly it's sourced. And if individuals can shift markets, which we've seen, procurement professionals can shift whole industries. And I think that is just so powerful. And I guess just the kind of potential agency that procurement professionals have, because the scale of choices you're making are much larger than those pertaining to any single individual, means you can drive change that protects nature, that reduces emissions, and that helps build a more resilient economy. You know, if you're choosing suppliers who prioritize renewable energy, you're supporting the transition away from fossil fuels. If you're selecting sustainably sourced timber or paper, you're helping to preserve forests that store carbon and sustain our declining threatened species. When you're embedding sustainability and transparency into procurement processes, you're sending a message, both up the corporate chain, but also to your own customers, that accountability isn't an optional, it's expected and it's being delivered. Just every single procurement decision is a chance to shift the needle. And nowadays, we have more tools than ever that can help us understand the climate and environmental impact of products and services, and to help us make informed decisions. And whether that's, mandatory or voluntary climate-related financial disclosures, or the European Union's anti-deforestation regs, or voluntary frameworks like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, all of them are powerful tools. And I just think that the landscape of influence that's open now to procurement professionals is really exciting.
I'd love to finish on a positive note, and I think you have done already, but are there any actions or any organizations that you're aware of, or even government policy that you're aware of that really inspires you and shows what can be done? And if you can tie it to a procurement lens, then fantastic. But is there anything that springs to mind?
I would like to share my favorite procurement influence story with you, actually.
Please do.
So in this day and age, I'm often called upon to defend multilateralism to people, right? Like, people look at the Paris Agreement or the Convention on Biological Diversity or the UN, and they're like, in the face of this sort of aggressive multipolarity in the global context, what does multilateralism offer us? So I always try and give people examples of when it's worked. And one of those examples I use for multilateralism is the Montreal Protocol, which is around, the actions that we took collectively as a global community to address the hole in the ozone layer. So that is a good one. If anyone tells you that the Paris Agreement can't or won't work, point them to the Montreal Protocol, because it did work very effectively. In procurement land, I think the most compelling example of the purchasing power that can shift whole global practices is actually the incredible turnaround we've had in the transition away from the practice of whaling. It's kind of an old story, right? Like, without completely divulging my age, the International Whaling Commission on moratorium on whaling was agreed in 1982, and it came into effect basically on my birthday 40 years ago in 1985. And at the time that moratorium was put in place, the global population of of blue whales was down to 1% of what it had been. Like, humanity slaughtered whales with just utter recklessness. The scale of loss it's actually really hard to describe. And across so many of those species, it was just cataclysmic. Like, we just didn't know if we were going to ever see them recover again. There was technological innovation that happened, right? Like, there were substitutes that were developed to whale oil. In fact, it was petroleum. But putting aside the fossil fuel situation, what really shifted the dial through the late 70s and early 80s was consumer behavior. And it was coupled with like awareness raising by the scientific community and NGOs. And then consumers and subsequently corporations actually took up the mantle to change their purchasing decisions. And with two very isolated exceptions, the international moratorium on whaling has been an enormous success. And in the 40 years since it came into place, we've seen almost full recovery of many whale populations. Like, it's pretty amazing. And to me, that is largely down to the power of individual people making a decision about what they will or will not purchase. And I think that's a really wonderful story. And as we look ahead to try and transition away from fossil fuels, it's actually kind of the right analogy for us to think about.
Wow, and you extrapolate the personal to the individual decisions there to what procurement do, and you know that can have a real impact. So I think that really helps put it into perspective.
Thank you, Kayla.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much to Kayla there for joining us. Really, really interesting conversation and a very important perspective. Maxfield, any final thoughts or takeaways from the conversation for you?
Yeah, James, that was really insightful and actually quite a nature-packed conversation that we just had. But I think there are three things that really stood out for me. I think the first was the immediacy, the way Kayla described what's happening, whether it's weather extremes or biodiversity loss. This isn't something on the horizon anymore. It's affecting how businesses operate and how economies function now, today. And I think the second thing is the shift in how we think about nature. It's not something external to business. It underpins everything, our supply chains, our raw materials, our ability to operate. It all depends on it, right? And if we're not factoring that into procurement decisions, we're not seeing the full picture. We're not doing our job. But the part that really stood out for me in terms of this conversation that we just had is where it connects directly to the CIPS in our community is the agency of procurement. I think that's something that came through really strong because procurement isn't just part of the system. It's one of the most powerful levers that we actually have to shape it. So every sourcing decision, every supplier choice that's influencing market behaviors, influencing outcomes for nature, all in totality. And I think that leads to a bigger realization for us as a community. This is really procurement's moment, right? We've moved from focusing on cost and efficiency to sitting right at the center of risk, of resilience, and ultimately sustainability as well in a world that's only getting more volatile. So I really think the key point here is this isn't about adding more to the profession. It's about, I would hope, and I would hope for our listeners, recognizing the power that's already there because every sourcing decision is now a strategy decision, and we have to look at it that way. And in that sense, sustainable procurement isn't a separate agenda. It's how we build resilience. It's how we protect value. It's how we shape the systems that our supply chains depend upon. And when you look at it that way, nature isn't this abstract concept. It's the system that our supply chains rely on. So this isn't about adding more to the procurement profession, as I said. It's about recognizing the strategic role the function already plays. And maybe just to end on a slightly lighter note, I think it's a really exciting time to be a procurement professional because the procurement profession sits closer to any of the consequences that a business, an organization faces, some of the most important decisions. And that's not just around performance, but for society and the planet as well. And I think this is so much bigger for our profession. And if nature, bringing it back to the concept of our discussion, is a system that everything depends upon, then procurement is one of the functions shaping the system every single day. And I think that's a pretty powerful place to be.
Couldn't sum it up better myself. I think it speaks to one of the things that we're doing this year at CIPS, having a great conversation and bringing through this procurement's new role, I think, in a new world. And there is a lot to take away from that. And I think Kayla said the very similar thing. Every single procurement decision is a chance to shift the needle. So I think yourself and Kayla have summed it up very well. Look, Maxfield, it was a pleasure to have you joining us for this episode. I've no doubt we'll hear more from you in the future on this podcast and on our webinars. Do connect with Maxfield on LinkedIn to keep in the loop with everything that he's doing at CIPS, leading the sustainability remit. But that is it for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast if you've enjoyed. Please do share it with your colleagues and your peers. This podcast has been brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. For more information on CIPS, head over to cips.org, where you can find out more about our upcoming events and all the excellent training opportunities on offer. For now, thank you, and we'll see you next time.